Welcome to today's presentation, part 3 of our cannabis series, Recent Science on Cannabis and a Changing Legal Climate, Opportunities for Prevention and Public Health Messaging. We would like to note that today's presentation is provided free of charge and is available in the public domain. Also, the information presented today are the views and opinions of Dr. Jason Kilmer and do not reflect the official position of HHS or SAMHSA. Please let us know if you have any questions regarding this disclaimer. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter today. Dr. Jason Kilmer is an associate professor in psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of Washington and serves as an investigator on several studies evaluating prevention and intervention efforts for alcohol, cannabis, and other drug use by college students. In addition to research and teaching, he has worked extensively with college students and student groups around alcohol and other drug prevention programming on over 120 campuses across the nation. Jason also serves as the chairperson of Washington State's College Coalition on Substance Misuse, Advocacy, and Prevention. He has been project faculty for several national learning collaboratives in the U.S., including NYU's National College Depression Partnership, Dartmouth's National College Health Improvement Program, and the NCAA's 360 Proof Project. He was one of the 6 members of the development team for the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism's College Alcohol Intervention Matrix, or College AIM. Jason was the 2014 recipient of the National Prevention Network's Award of Excellence for Outstanding Contributions to the Field of Prevention, and was also the 2017 recipient of the Washington State Prevention Professional Award of Excellence. I will now turn the time over to our presenter, Dr. Jason Kilmer.
Taylor, thank you. You've been so great to work with, and I appreciate that kind introduction and the chance to work with you today. To all of you joining, thank you. I will say 2 things. One, the chat is enabled. So if there are questions people have, comments, I know it's being monitored. And I know we have time at the end for questions. Certainly, if there's anything that needs immediate clarifying, we'll try and address that at the time. Second, I would fear the person that claims they have all the answers. That is not me. I've done what I can to bring in what the science says in a way that hopefully is useful for all of you participating today. Big thank you to the crew at the Mountain Plains PTTC for all they did to make this happen today. As far as objectives, talked about people being able to identify a screening measure for cannabis use disorder, be able to identify at least 2 risks or outcomes associated with cannabis use, and be able to identify at least 1 prevention or public health approach or opportunity for use in your community. All in 55 minutes, because we're going to keep this exactly on pace. I also want to thank Zoom. Couldn't do this without Zoom. Plus, I appreciate that Zoom is gaining empathy. It's gaining emotional intelligence, which wouldn't seem possible, but it's true. I didn't notice it till last spring. I was sent a Zoom link for a presentation I was doing for the state of Louisiana. And when they sent me the Zoom link actually said, which is how I feel all the time. And it won't stop. It keeps happening. Here's the one Taylor sent me today. So big thanks to Zoom for understanding so much how I feel. When we talk about cannabis use, you will hear me interchangeably use the phrase cannabis, marijuana. Even going back 10 years ago, along with Colorado, the state of Washington, were the first 2 states to legalize cannabis for non-medical, or in quotes, recreational purposes. We don't even really use that term anymore. We don't talk about recreational alcohol use. Recreation is doing stuff outdoors. So we tend to make a distinction more between medical and non-medical. But even then, it was mainly smokable bud or flower, or maybe edibles. Products are changing so much that we have to acknowledge that there are many different means and routes of use. Cannabis as an umbrella term seems to cover more of the products, but as you'll see, not everyone completely knows what that term means, depending on the age group you're working with. If smoked, smokable bud or flower can go in joints, bongs, pipes. It can be vaped in a vaporizer, orally ingested, infused drinks, brewed as a tea, gummies, cookies, brownies, edibles, in quotes, concentrates, which are extracted cannabinoids. Dabbing is a verb. People use dab pens to hit these high potency concentrates. Hash oil, butter, shatter. If smoked or vaped, people feel it pretty immediately. If orally ingested, there's a lag. 30 to 60 minutes in the published literature. Retail stores in my state warn people for the potential of a 2-hour lag. Think about why that matters, especially in terms of dosing. Now, if it helps your state not reinvent the proverbial wheel, in my state, the Washington Liquor and Cannabis Board and the Department of Health partnered to run more focus groups that you can imagine with people as young as 12 up to much, much older adults to see what words do they use, what words do they understand, what words upset them, and so on. What I'm going to say is this: at the end of the day, use the word the human being across from you is using. If you're talking to someone and they say, I use weed every day, we're not going to correct them and say, could you please call it this? But if it helps, you can go to this link. It'll be in your handouts. Please note, this is not a typo from me. This is a typo in the link, sadly. Due to budget cuts, the letters NO were cut from the term terminology. But what they said was, based on the audience, the different terms they recommend. When we talk about youth, when we talk about young adults, the term marijuana is what's been recommended. You'll see me increasingly use the term cannabis/marijuana. When we talk about norms, you know your own state best, you know your own region best, and you have your own data. But I think what's compellingly clear is that most people don't use cannabis. That said, there are such pronounced misperceptions about that. Sandra Wolfson is the first researcher to show the most significant misperceptions of cannabis use come from those that use most frequently. If someone uses every day, they're convinced that everyone, in quotes, uses daily and that all your data are wrong. These are data from SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, National Survey on Drug Use and Health, their most recent one. 12 to 17-year-olds, 10% use cannabis in the past year. The age group I tend to work with on college campuses, 34.5%, 18 to 25-year-olds, 26 and older, it's 16.3%. Three things to conclude from this slide. First, big thank you to SAMHSA for putting me in an age group with 26-year-olds. Thanks, SAMHSA. Second, most people aren't using. No matter what age group you look at, the overwhelming majority don't use. That said, and third, 18 to 25-year-olds are the group that we do tend to see the most prevalent use among. We see this be a consistent theme. The Monitoring the Future study out of Michigan shows that most 8th, 10th, and 12th graders aren't using. When you look at past year use, 8th graders 7%, 10th graders 17%, 12th graders 30.5%. When we look at current use, past 30-day use, these numbers predictably go down. I like to invoke a phrase I hear my friend and colleague, Dr. Jeff Linkenbach from Montana say. He says, when we look at statistics, we need to balance hope and concern. While it's concerning, the 19.5% of 12th graders report they've used cannabis at least once in the past 30 days. It's hopeful the most, 80.5%, don't. Among college students, yeah, they're the group with the most prevalent use, yet most don't use. And when we look at past month use, about 24.5% use, which means 3/4 don't. Young adults, not in college, very comparable data. However, the misperceptions persist. I was lead author on a study we did years ago that we asked almost 6,000 college students, how often have you used cannabis? At least once in the past year. A third said at least once. So what do most people do? Not use. When we ask people, what does the typical student do? Only 2% of students correctly said, I feel like the typical person doesn't use. 98% of people thought the typical person used at least once per year. What we found is that the more mispronounced that perception was, the more likely people were to use frequently, and even use with consequences. Spoiler, if you're looking for public health opportunities, shedding a light on what most people do by correcting misperceived norms will likely pay big dividends in the work that you do. The problem is perceived risk of cannabis keeps going down. When I'm principal investigator of our state's young adult health survey. We've been collecting data since before stores opened in 2014 and every year since. Mike Gilson has a paper under revision that showed that perceived harm of cannabis use, whether it's occasional use, regular use, physical or psychological or emotional harm, keeps going down over time. Perceived risk of alcohol is actually going up, except in the case of 5 or more drinks every weekend, which has simply stayed high. Yet the science shows and tells a very different story. I'm going to try and shed some light on that story right now. I'll pause and ask, since I see there's 31 things in the chat since I last looked, I'll ask our moderators what questions have come through relevant to data I've already shown already, in case anything needs clarification at this point.
I haven't seen any questions.
All right, thanks for clarifying. So I used to say in science, we've got to catch up on what people are actually using. Guess what? People have caught up, and that's fantastic. If you orient the brain, such as the front of the brain's on the left, back of the brain's on the right, look at all these different parts of the brain and the functions or behaviors they're associated with. Coordination, vision, sensations, movement, the amygdala, judgment or decision-making, hippocampus. This is where we see attention, concentration, and memory. But substances where there's a high, we tend to see activity in the reward pathway of the brain. The most well-studied cannabinoid in cannabis, THC, where does it bind? All over the place. What drives the high? THC binds to the reward pathway. For years, people have said, well, does marijuana affect motivation? Motivation is hard to study, but what regulates motivation? The anterior cingulate cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Don't worry about the fancy words. Where's that in the brain? Right here. And THC binds to those portions of the brain. So what we've long said is, if THC potency is changing, we've got to be aware of the impact that can have on human beings. What do scientists consider the strong stuff? High potency cannabis, anything over 10% THC. Please keep that number in mind. Now, El Soli and colleagues looked at seizures by the DEA in the illicit market over 2 decades. And when packaged with Dr. Nora Volkoff's 2014 article, it lets us estimate cannabis potency going back to the 1970s. When you hear people who are older today reflecting on their time in the 1970s, and they say that they, in quotes, smoked grass, it's because it was practically grass. It was 1% THC, 1.5% at best. In the 80s, 2 to 3% THC. By the 90s, may all of your retirement portfolios grow like this. By 95, we cleared 4%. By 2001, we cleared 6%. By 2006, 8%, we hit double digits in 2010. But then the chart runs out. They updated the study. In the United States, in the illicit market, we've seen products that scientists consider to be high potency for the last 10 years. Yet what has happened in states that have legalized? In my state, second ever marijuana impact report, at the time of its release, the average potency in smokable bud or flower, a never before seen 13.18%. Never before seen until you come to my state. In one store that allowed their products to be analyzed for the purposes of the report, the average potency in smokable bud or flower, a never before seen 21.62%. Hash oils, concentrates, what people use for dabbing, nationwide, the average was 55.85%. In Seattle, that store was pushing 72%. Let's look further. Smart and colleagues looked at what happened once retail stores opened in Washington state. On the y-axis, this is the percentage of sales of cannabis flower products. This excludes the concentrates. On the x-axis, month and year. What's that little baby blue sliver? Cannabis under 10% THC. It's been virtually eliminated from the retail market. I've been on Zoom for 27 months. Sorry for saying virtually. Brick red, 10 to 15, green, 15 to 20, purple, over 20%. We are a high potency market. Cash and colleagues eliminated any doubt when they looked at medical and, in quotes, recreational programs in the United States. In Colorado, 95.91% of their recreational market is high potency cannabis. California is only 0.01% off. They had medical outlets and non-medical outlets. The only difference with California is that a larger slice of the pie is 10 to 15%. In my state, it's 97%. Just to show you a few other examples, New England, very similar story. Overwhelming majority of the market, high potency cannabis. New Mexico, high potency cannabis. So 2 things I will say. When people say, well, it's just weed, it honestly stopped being just weed years ago. When people say, but it's natural, those concentrates do not occur in nature. That takes intentional extraction of cannabinoids for consumption in a high potency way. Smokable bud or flower that's 20 to 30% THC, that doesn't occur in nature. That takes intentional breeding of created high potency strains. So one might say, well, so who cares? Why does potency matter? Well, it matters in a big way. And the science, all recent, is telling a very consistent story. DeForty and colleagues across 11 cities in Europe and Brazil showed that compared to people who don't use cannabis at all, the odds of developing a psychotic disorder, developing psychosis for people who use anything over 10% THC on a daily basis go up 5 to 6 times in odds ratios, 5 to 6 times compared to people who don't use it all. Hines and colleagues showed at the start of the pandemic that among people using up till the age of 24, risk of being addicted, more generalized anxiety disorder when they're using high potency cannabis, anything over 10% THC. Out of Canada, they say with high potency products, more problematic cannabis use disorder, more mental health disorders. In my state, our state's prevention research subcommittee approached 9 researchers at the University of Washington and Washington State University. I was honored to be one of the 9. They said, we're hearing loud and clear, something's changed in Washington, and we need scientists to weigh in on these high potency products. They said, we don't want any one scientist to do this. It's too easy to be accused of bias. We don't want any one school to do this. They jokingly said, UW and WSU, you're rivals. You don't agree on anything. If all 9 of you can agree on what the science says, we will release a consensus report. If you can't agree, well, thanks for your time. This isn't going to see the light of day. All 9 of us agreed. You can go to this link, it will be in your handouts. You can download the complete 20-page research report. There's a 2-page Cliff Notes version. Cliff was my favorite author when I was younger, so shout out to Cliff. And there's even slides you can download. But when preparing for today's presentation, I was reminded that our group concluded that young people are really vulnerable to these high potency products. Honestly, before the age of 25, these high potency products really need to be taken seriously. And the risk of being addicted, cannabis use disorder, particularly among adolescents, is higher with the use of these high potency products. So with that, I tried to pick 5 domains relevant to public health that are in no particular order we can review. I will again pause, ask the moderators to see what questions, comments are coming in, if anything.
I haven't seen anything.
All right, I appreciate you monitoring it and keeping track. A question came in while we're talking about potency that says, wouldn't the potency in cannabis kind of be like the different potency in alcohol as well? Beer compared to Everclear would kind of be the same at 10% to up. One of the biggest differences we see is, well, we see a couple. Whiskey today has the same alcohol by volume as whiskey 50 years ago. Beer today, granted, there are, let me say domestic beer, essentially the same alcohol by volume. That's not the case. And so especially when you hear older adults today say, why are we so worried about this? If they say, I used when I was younger and I turned out fine, they used different stuff. I also come to you from a state in which our state's attorney generals, along with the state of New York, literally went after high potency products with alcohol. For Loco, 12% alcohol by volume in a 23.5 ounce can was targeted as being unsafe for people. And those were, they used to have stimulants in them. The stimulants were removed. There was a lot of outrage about access to these high potency blackouts in a can, as they called it during those high profile lawsuits. We don't tend to see that same amount of outrage, frankly. So yes, there are different products until you realize that, imagine 97% of alcohol stores were Everclear, to your question. In my state, 97% of our retail market is high potency product. So I hope that makes sense. Another question that came in Questions as they go rather than waiting to the end in case we don't get to them. Okay. Is higher potency bud coming only from dispensaries, also street sources? You saw that street sources are way lower potency than what we see in the dispensaries and in retail stores. Now, part of the thing is our products also working their way in to illicit market that are being resold. That's an empirical question. Why is potency higher? I will try and take some of these to the end because I was asked to do 55 minutes and the clock's ticking. I'll try and address some of those as we go, but I hope the clarification questions were useful. All right, so impact on attention, concentration, and memory. If I was told you can show one slide to students that want to go to college one day or who are actively in college, I would show them this slide. The part of the brain that, among other things, affects attention, concentration, and memory is the hippocampus. Truly long story short, after cannabis use, the neurons in this part of the brain get suppressed. They fire, but they fire at a rate that's slower and slower than they could or should be firing. Harrison Pope is a scientist who in the 90s said, I want to test this with college students, but I don't want to get people super high and make them take a test and say, well, clearly it affected their cognitive abilities. He said, I want to test, I want to have people use cannabis. I want to test them 24 hours later. 24 hours later, there are measurable decreases in all of these cognitive abilities. And the more frequently people used, the more more pronounced these decreases were. Scientists said, that's a game changer. Like literally no one had ever shown that before. And what it means is a day later, there is an impact. And there does seem to be an additive or cumulative effect. Critics of this said, is it a game changer? It's not causal. What if people who struggle with attention happen to be attracted to cannabis? You don't know what comes first. Dr. Pope said, that's fair. We can test that. Ethically, we can't take people who don't use and make them start because that's unethical. But what if we take people who use every day and we have them quit? If you follow them over time and their cognitive abilities remain the same, yeah, maybe they were there to start with. But if they abstain from marijuana, and as they abstain, their cognitive abilities improve, that, my friends, is causal. It takes 28 days, but 4 weeks after stopping daily cannabis use, there are no longer any significant differences in attention, concentration, and memory compared to a control group of people who don't use at all. Down in Susan Tapert's lab in San Diego, she looked at a sample of 15 to 19-year-olds who used, on average, every other day, 14 days in the past 30. It took 2 weeks of abstinence for verbal learning to match that of people who don't use. Verbal working memory, 3 weeks of abstinence. Attention takes the full 4 weeks. Think of what this means. If someone says, I have ADHD and I'm being treated for it, we can look them in the eye and say, marijuana is a horrible fit. We know of no substance more associated with causing attention decreases, let alone worsening existing ones. If someone says, I wonder if I have ADHD, can I get a stimulant prescribed to me? And they're using cannabis, how can we pretend to prescribe or diagnose if they're using a substance that causes attention decreases? I do a lot of work around motivational interviewing. If someone says, my goal, I want to do well in school. What's the status quo? I'm not doing so hot because my attention, memory, and concentration stink. If they're using marijuana, stopping their marijuana use will pay dividends on their cognitive abilities. And the good thing is the science shows that stopping does translate to improved success. DuPont and colleagues showed, looking at K through 12, that of all the problems that contribute to dropping out, substance use is one of the easiest to identify, and it's something we can do something about. When adolescents stop using substances, they do better in school. Students who use substances are at increased risk for academic failure, including dropping out. And while both alcohol and cannabis matter, marijuana has a stronger negative relationship to grade point average and other outcomes and risk for dropout than alcohol use does. The more severe the substance use, the more likely the impact on academic performance and risk for dropout. On college campuses, the more frequently students use cannabis, the lower their grade point average tends to be, the more classes they skip, the less likely are to still be enrolled. When followed over time, the less likely are to graduate on time. We're having very important conversations about how to make or keep college more affordable. One of the ways, without being flippant, is to get out on time. And the science is showing the more people are using cannabis, when followed over time, the less likely are to still be enrolled less likely are to graduate on time. The narrative of the last 2+ years have been, let's be a champion for students. Let's be a champion for student outcomes. Let's be a champion for student success. If true, they should also be a champion for prevention. They should be a champion for the work you all do. What you do about cannabis use from a public health and prevention standpoint will pay dividends in academic success. A backdoor, if not front door way to address this also has to do with the impact of cannabis use on sleep quality and subsequent effects. These are data from fall of 2019. Remember fall 2019? This is over 30,000 students, 58 schools across the country. They ask students, how you doing in school? I'm doing great. You move on. How you doing in school? Not so hot. What gets in the way of doing the way you want to do? Here's 51 possible barriers to academic success. What do students say? Procrastination, stress, anxiety, sleep difficulties. Cannabis use is in 40th place. My friend Amelia Aria has said, if we put a better spotlight on the science showing cannabis is associated with academic outcomes, we might actually boost help seeking in students struggling academically who also use cannabis, if they're saying, I want to do better in school, because it might help them make that connection. But I digress. Look at these top 4. I think there's a way we can address this. Angarita and colleagues show that a lot of people will say, if I use marijuana at night, I fall asleep faster. That's true. Onset of sleep is more rapid with something that's a sedative, hypnotic. Sedative means sedating, hypnotic means sleep inducing. But ask the people you're working with, on nights where you use weed, what do you notice about your sleep? Tell me about your dreaming. They're like, whoa, how did you know? I don't dream at all. And I sleep hard. I sleep and I mean it. Here's why. Perfect night sleep should look like this. Rapid eye movement sleep, where we do our dreaming, should get longer, longer, longer. Non-REM, probably most well known as stage 4 or deep sleep, should get less and less and less. With cannabis, stage 4 or deep sleep gets extended and there's no REM. That's why people will feel like they sleep hard. That's why people will feel like they're not dreaming, because they're genuinely not entering REM sleep. Who cares? What's the impact of a night of REM deprived sleep? Increases the next day in sleepiness, anxiety, irritability, and jumpiness. Use multiple nights in a row. This is additive or cumulative. Take a night off, the body goes through REM rebound. I can't graphically show you insomnia any better than right there. A person will slam so fast into deep, immediately into REM, that rapid cycling leads to difficulty falling and staying asleep. Once they get to sleep, too much time in REM, not enough time in the other stages of sleep, increase in fatigue the next day. What do college students say are 3 of their 4 biggest barriers to doing well in school? Stress, anxiety, and sleep problems. All 3 of those can be made worse by their nighttime marijuana use. They can be flat out caused by their cannabis use. What's someone's value? I want to do well in school. What's the status quo? Well, I'd be doing a lot better if I wasn't tired all the time, stressed and anxious. If they make the connection that their nighttime cannabis use could be worsening or causing those very barriers, it could prompt consideration of change or commitment to change. Number 3, factors associated with health and mental health. I should pause and see what clarifying questions have come through, if any. I hear nothing from the moderator. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, there are no clarifying questions.
Okay, I'll keep moving. We'll save any non-clarifying questions for the end. Factors associated with health and mental health, not already addressed earlier. So Wayne Hall at the University of Queensland in Australia, to me, is planet Earth's single biggest cannabis expert. Dr. Hall's work is amazing. And he's been saying for years in his research, something that very recent research is consistent, is verifying. And that is, we've got to take cannabis and mental health seriously. His groundbreaking article with his colleague, Louise Degenhart, showed that those that use cannabis 10 or more times by the age of 18 were 2 to 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. This finding is so clear, they concluded that 13% of schizophrenia could go away if cannabis use was prevented. I had the honor of moderating a webinar with Dr. Hall, and I said, if we could do one thing in my state post-legalization, what would you recommend? He didn't even hesitate. He said, you've got to screen for cannabis use disorder in your counseling and health centers. Those of you going, I hope I remember the learning objectives. Pay attention to this next part. I asked him, what would you recommend for screening? He said, well, there's a gold standard measure that I'll share with you, but you need to understand why screening is so important. He said, we don't know what comes first. We don't know what drives what, but we see a scary three-way interaction between being addicted, cannabis use disorder, depression, and suicide. We do not know what comes first, but if someone willing to seek help for their depression flags as cannabis dependent, or if you're already screening for depression with the PHQ-2, the PHQ-9, patient health questionnaire, pardon me, then you could screen too, because if they flag for both, they pose a suicide risk. He said, if you have a waiting list, don't put them on the waiting list. When I asked, what would you recommend for screening? The Cannabis Use Disorder Identification Test Revised. The link to this from the Washington Recovery Helpline will be in your handouts. It starts with a simple yes, no. Have you used cannabis over the past 6 months? If no, you're done. If yes, there's 8 items. How to score it is right here. How to interpret it is right here. I looked at the most recent National Survey on Drug Use and Health just to update my numbers, and they're even more clear to what Dr. Hall said 9 years ago. Looking at people with past year cannabis use compared to people without, you see more than 2 times prevalence in serious thoughts of suicide, 2.5 times in making a suicide plan, almost 3 times in attempting suicide. Yet Dr. Hall did not say use. He said use at the level of a cannabis use disorder. These numbers are huge to me. Serious thoughts of suicide, 6-fold, 6 times greater in those with the past year cannabis use disorder compared to those without a past year substance use disorder. Making a suicide plan, 7 times greater. Attempting suicide, 7 times greater. Lori Davidson, in her work with the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, said, hey, want to be a community that does good suicide prevention? Do good alcohol prevention. Because what you do to reduce high-risk drinking will pay dividends on mental health and suicide. I feel the same could be said with cannabis prevention. I hear people go, well, you can't overdose on marijuana. That's not true. It looks different. There's hyperemesis, which is violent, aggressive vomiting. There's what people in kind of slang terms call greening out. But we also see an acute toxic psychosis, different than onset of a psychotic disorder. People might hallucinate, see, feel, or hear things that aren't there. Delusions, including being exceptionally paranoid, out-of-body stuff, depersonalization that we would normally see with dissociative drugs. What causes that? If people use too much or potency is too high. What are we seeing? Through the roof, potency levels. Wouldn't it have been nice to go a whole 55 minutes and not hear this word? Well, you're in luck. I'm not going to say this word. I've been Voldemorting the name of this virus, the virus that shall not be named. If you name it, it gives it power. We'd only been home 2.5 weeks when the National Institute on Drug Abuse said, heads up, because this attacks the lungs, this could be a real threat to people who smoke tobacco or marijuana or who vape. By summer of 2020, researchers at Stanford University said people who smoke or vape cannabis or tobacco are more likely to get sick, and when they get sick, have a more severe infection. Any doubt was eliminated when Gaia, Cheng, and Halper and Fischer, in a sample of 4,351 13 to 24-year-olds, showed that those that vape, 5 times greater likelihood of testing positive, those that vape and smoke, 7 times greater likelihood. I have heard people incorrectly say, do we have time for AOD prevention? Because shouldn't the priority be the pandemic? What you do about juuling cessation, vaping cessation, smoking cessation will pay dividends related to the pandemic. If at this stage in the presentation, you're thinking to yourself, wow, that Jason Kilmer has brought his slides to life with his stylus, you would be right. The first time my stylus shot out of my laptop, I was like, I broke my laptop. My friend said it's a stylus. I said, I don't know what that is. She said, you can use it to draw and stuff. And now I just can't be stopped. So I made this Sasquatch for today's presentation. I drew a squirrel. I feel like I got a strong squirrel game. And then I made this tree and I brought them all together into one majestic image that I hope you find enjoyable. I figure at least 5 of you are like, what is happening right now? What is this thing? Number 1 is addiction risk and withdrawal. The last student I saw in person met with me to say, I feel like I'm addicted. And I said, how can I help you? He said, by telling me if that's possible. Because my roommates keep saying, you can't get addicted to weed. Yes, you can. And that's not new. In the old days, 2012, we had the DSM-4 and we had cannabis dependence and cannabis abuse. When the DSM-5 came out, when we bailed on the Roman numerals, take that, Rome, we had DSM-5, we talked about substance use disorder and specifically cannabis use disorder. And based on the number of symptoms people endorse, they get a rating of mild, moderate, or severe. I hope none of you mishear me at all, and I will make as clear as I can. If you have a friend, a family member, a loved one with a gravely disabling or potentially lethal condition that's had medical cannabis recommended and are using as recommended, then bless that person. That's not who I'm talking about. But I really, really worry about the severely depressed 18-year-old who says, I don't want to go to counseling. I don't want to talk to a healthcare provider. I just want to get a medical card for marijuana. I really, really worry about someone who says, I'm going to quit taking my medication because I don't want to put meds in my body. I want to use something natural. I want to use marijuana instead. Here's why. I had the honor of presenting in Canada the week that they legalized nationwide for recreational, in quotes, purposes. And ironically, as they were getting ready to open the floodgates across Canada for non-medical use, their medical providers were saying, we have got to slow down on medical cannabis. What's the key to any medication? Well, there are 4. What's the addiction potential? Obviously, we talk about that with opiates all the time, right? Do the benefits outweigh the consequences? Has it been tested in randomized controlled trials with a placebo condition to control for placebo effects? Are there effective treatments already out there? So I saw all these headlines. I went to the original article by Alan and colleagues. I genuinely think this is a must read. If you're like, I don't have time to read 10 pages, I'm with you. And read figure 1. They said, if someone says, hi, healthcare provider, can I get something written that gives me a medical cannabis card? If yes, is it for neuropathic pain, palliative and end-of-life pain, chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, or spasticity due to multiple sclerosis or spinal cord injury? If no, we're done. We're not giving it for anxiety, depression, headaches, sleep, back pain. How come? The science is not there. It's an addictive substance. Any self-reported improvements or benefits are not outweighed by the numerous consequences. And for those of you who work in counseling, bless you and thank you. And counseling works. There are therapies that work. There's treatments that work. If it's yes, have they tried traditional therapies and treatments first? If no, go back to the drawing board. Only if yes. They say we recommend a medical cannabinoid, but they say heads up, people shouldn't smoke their medicine. If you continue to enjoy the stylus drawings, I made this for my niece, and when I texted it to her, she said, Uncle Jason, I love you, but you really need a hobby. And I've never felt more understood by a child in my life. People say, but what about CBD? That works for everything. A double-blind experiment, which is essential. It eliminates expectancies. Instead of telling people, oh, you're anxious, use this, it'll help. People were recruited to an experiment where they signed a consent form and said, I agree to take something that might include CBD. Double blind. They didn't know what they were taking. The person bringing it to them didn't know what they were taking. They had 4 different trials where they took 300, 600, a stunning 900 milligrams of CBD or a placebo. Then they went through tasks that introduced them to negative emotional stimuli. It induced unwanted mood or affect. It induced anxiety. When you eliminate expectancies, what did CBD do? Nothing. I hope none of you mishear me. I'm not saying CBD does nothing, period. Alan and colleagues showed the 4 health domains where medical cannabinoids could be an adjunct to treatment. But quoting verbatim, oral CBD does not alter responses to emotional stimuli or produce anxiolytic. What does that word mean? Anxiety reducing, like effects in healthy human subjects. It has been a stressful last 27 months. If people are struggling with anxiety, let's get them connected with services that work. rather than products making the claim of effectiveness where the science just isn't there. This article came out just shy of 3 months ago, and it has become all the talk in my state. This is the study we were waiting for. Gilman and colleagues looked at people in Massachusetts that said, I want to get a medical marijuana card. They either got it or they were put in a 12-week control group. Now, people could use weed on their own. Anyone already using daily was excluded from the study. Anyone already meeting criteria for cannabis use disorder was excluded from the study. Not surprisingly, the group that got the card immediately, their use increased over time compared to the control group. Somewhat surprisingly, especially since the narrative is you can't get addicted to weed, is that cannabis use disorder symptomatology increased in the group that got it immediately as well, whereas that didn't change in the group that was in the control group. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, this is one of those pictures. I don't want anyone to think I'm putting words in their mouth. I'm quoting verbatim. There were no observed benefits of obtaining a medical marijuana card for pain, anxiety, or depressive symptoms. This is baseline. Anything that exceeds the baseline is significantly different. So no change in pain severity, depression, or anxiety. What got way worse? Getting addicted to marijuana. What got better? Self-reported improvement with insomnia. We talked about that in number 4. Onset of sleep is faster. Quality of sleep gets destroyed. They said because those with affective disorders, mood and anxiety, have almost 4 times higher odds of meeting criteria for cannabis use disorder, we've got to be aware of what this means. Quoting verbatim, these data suggest that a medical marijuana card may pose a high risk or may even be contraindicated for people with affective disorders. This finding is important to replicate because depression has been reported as the 3rd most common reason that people seek a medical marijuana card. Finally, I want to know how many people report medical use that are actually managing addiction. My friend and colleague, Dr. Christine Lee, asked incoming first-year students to our school, tell us why you use marijuana. And they said stuff like, I like getting high. I like how it feels, gives me something to do with my friends, helps when I'm bored, makes things more fun, music sounds better, it's cool, it helps me celebrate. But they also said, helps me relax, helps me sleep, helps me cope when I'm depressed, relieves stress, helps when my appetite sucks, reduces anxiety, alleviates physical pain, helps when I have a headache. Is cannabis addictive? Yes, it is. Are there criteria for withdrawal? Yes, there are. What are those criteria? Keeping this list in mind, it's this list: anxiety, sleep problems, appetite problems, depressed mood, and headaches. If someone says to you, I know it helps my anxiety, ask them, how do you know? If they say, I use weed every day. Last week I ran out for 3 days and it was brutal. My anxiety was terrible. Couldn't sleep. Finally got my hands on weed again. Everything got better. That's not marijuana treating underlying anxiety. That's resuming substance use, making withdrawal symptoms stop. And that's an instance of managing addiction more than managing underlying health concerns. I'm really mindful of the time. Do people know what time it is? It's bonus content time. Woo! How could I pick 5 when there's so much more I could say? Driving. The authors of Initiative 502 in my state said a DUI, a per se limit, is 5 nanograms of THC per milliliter of blood for those over 21, any positive amount for those under 21. Why'd they pick 5? It's not the same as being drunk, but you see the same impairment in reaction time and challenge shifting focus when there's multiple competing stimuli, as you see at 0.08 with alcohol. The $1 million question is, since we don't have a breathalyzer for cannabis, how long does it take to drop below that? The best research we have says 6 to 8 hours after inhaling, 8 to 12 hours after ingesting. Stores opened in my state in 2014. In 2015, our top story was that fatalities behind the wheel of a car with THC present increased and actually even almost doubled. By 2017, we became one of the first states in which drug driving deaths outnumbered drunk driving deaths, which remains the case so far in 2022. And if a picture's worth 1,000 words, here's another such picture. This is not police activity. This is not DUIs. This is not a new way of testing. This is the grim graphing of drivers in fatal crashes who, as the driver, were THC positive. Stable, 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 stable. Legalization, increase, increase, increase. So in wrapping up, On college campuses for alcohol, we have the college alcohol intervention matrix. I'm not going to talk about that. I want to quote it though. It says, want to make a difference from a public health standpoint? Consider a mix of strategies. Your best chance for creating a safer campus could come from a combination of individual and environmental level interventions that work together to maximize positive effects. Yes, yes, and yes. When you look at what do we need to do with cannabis, the same thing. We need a mix that includes but is not limited to policies and then enforcement of those policies. Education, prevention, intervention, treatment, support for people in recovery. All of that is true. And I want to read to you something that I've been quoting for a decade that feels different now than it did 10 years ago. But Fixon and colleagues, when saying, how do we get evidence-based strategies out there? They said the use of effective interventions on a scale sufficient to benefit society requires careful attention to implementation strategies as well. One without the other is like serum without a syringe. The cure is available, but the delivery system is not. Let's go back to this. What if you have the best program ever for people mandated to attend after a policy violation, but you don't have consistent enforcement of policy? The cure is available, the delivery system is not. What if you have the best relapse prevention program ever, the best treatment program ever for cannabis, but people don't know how to access it? The cure is available, the delivery system is not. Our job is to explore all those different possible delivery systems and partners in prevention when it comes to things like that. I think one possible delivery system, SBIRT, screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. If someone comes into a healthcare provider, we ask them about alcohol, we ask them about cigarette use, why wouldn't we ask about cannabis use? Brief interventions, typically motivational or awareness-raising interventions to prompt thinking about or committing to change. Referral to treatment, pretty self-explanatory. Brief interventions for cannabis work. In the age group I work with, I was honored to be co-author on a study that Christine Lee led that showed that in-person personalized feedback using motivation interviewing showed reductions in use, time spent high, and consequences. SBIRT works. Especially if you're working with youth, be aware of articles in the news alongside ads, alongside pro-health messages. In the alcohol world, we know that the more kids see the portrayal of alcohol on TV, movies, or ads, the more likely people who don't drink are to initiate, and those already drinking will increase their consumption. Between cannabis ads, human interest stories, recipes, you name it, that digestion of media becomes relevant too. There are high-risk events or times a year that could warrant event-specific prevention efforts, particularly around driving. Bravo and colleagues showed that April 20th, 420, is a high-risk event. High Times Magazine made that a thing years ago, and big fans of cannabis view it as kind of a holiday. More people report use on 420 than other days, more unique sessions of use, and a larger amount used. What's the sad thing? The risk of a fatal crash goes up on 420 compared to control days, when you account for everything else you can control for. What's the not so good news? That can be a risky day in our communities. What's the better news? We know when that is. Like, heads up, you can start planning for April 20th, 2023. There are misperceptions around norms. These can be corrected. They can be done individually. They can be done environmentally. Most people aren't using. Most people are not driving under the influence. The more people use, the more they think others are using. And if you correct misperceptions, behaviors tend to change. Using data from our Young Adult Health Survey, Mike Graham Squire and his team at Neighborhood House launched the Most Steer Clear campaign, which made very, very clear, especially because there was a dramatic gap in what people perceived, what was actually the case, that most people aren't using. Most people aren't driving. He even built in the guidelines on how long to wait after driving, which I think is a really cool blend of norms correction and educational content. I will say, I know Rory asked me to talk about youth, but do consider what you're offering in terms of prevention and public health efforts for those turning 21. We just had released a couple months ago an article that I'm lead author on, where we asked in our Young Adult Health Survey over 6 time points, just shy of 13,000 18 to 25-year-olds, starting right before stores opened in 2014 and on all 5 years after that. My friends, we tried to be as conservative as we could. We co-varied and tried to account for differences based on sex assigned at birth, race, ethnicity, geographic region of the state, age, four-year college status, full-time employment status. We even computed post-stratification weights to make sure that our data matched census data as best as we could. In the American Journal of Public Health, we were delighted to get this published, and it showed that after legalization was implemented, after stores opened, in this already at-risk group of 18 to 25-year-olds, if you follow my cursor, any past year use is going up significantly. At least monthly, going up significantly. At least weekly, going up significantly. At least daily, going up significantly. And a deeper dive shows it's those over 21 driving a lot of that. Any past year cannabis use, that significant finding for this age group, as identified by SAMHSA, is being driven by the 21 and older. At least monthly, driven by the 21 and older. But I want you to know, it's not just more people trying marijuana, more people are getting addicted. We also found a significant increase in endorsement of at least 2 past year cannabis use disorder symptoms. On college campuses, so many places are like, well, what are we going to offer our first year students? That's fair. What are you going to offer your students turning 21? So I would encourage you, if you're in a state where 21-year-olds have legal access, think about what that means from a prevention standpoint. Messaging from parents and other adults is really important and influential. These are data from alcohol, and I want to end by showing this to you because Annie Fairley did this brilliant study where she asked people before they started college, end of their first year and end of their second year. She wanted to predict binge drinking, 5 drinks in a row for males, 4 drinks in a row for females, as a function of social modeling, number of close friends who drink heavily, and perceived friend approval of drinking and getting drunk, as well as parental permissiveness. Want to see a perfect figure? Since data never turn out this way, here's a perfect figure. Binge drinking episodes is on the y-axis, time on the x-axis. What's the top line? High social modeling, high parental permissiveness. Next line down, low social modeling, high parental permissiveness. High social modeling, low parental permissiveness, pardon me. Parents and messaging from parents can alter the experience of students that go to a high-risk group of friends, a high-risk setting like a fraternity or sorority, and even a campus or community with a reputation for drinking. I'll say one more time. High social modeling, high parental permissiveness. Next line down, same high social modeling, low parental permissiveness. And it keeps happening. Next line down, low social modeling, high parental permissiveness. Next line down, low social modeling, low parental permissiveness. Parents matter. In my state, these are sophomores in high school. Hey kids, do you think your parents think it's wrong for you to use or not wrong? When kids say, I think it's wrong, my parents would say it's wrong, 13% report past month use. When kids say, my parents don't care, 59% use. You saw all the prevalence 100 slides ago. Seriously, it's been over 100 slides. And most don't use, that's not true of high school sophomores who think their parents wouldn't care if they used or not. Community norms matter. Influential adults matter. Hey kids, do you think the community would think it's wrong for you to use? 16% have used. When they go, the community wouldn't care, that more than doubles. In our young adult health survey, we ask 18, 19, 20-year-olds who report any use, where do you get cannabis? We see a significant decrease in getting it from friends and medical sources, which makes sense because medical outlets closed in Washington. Where is it going up? Giving money to someone to get it for them, getting it from family, getting it from parents with their permission. I don't know if parents are operating off of an old script of I used and I turned out fine. I don't know if they're unaware of the research on mental health risks. I don't know if they're unaware of the science on academic outcomes, but we can get parents on board as partners in prevention. Obviously, you have your own local resources. I'm very proud of Washington's Start Talking Now, which in 3 easy steps, as they say, give guidelines for how to talk about substance use with kids. In Washington, we created a parent's guide to preventing underage marijuana use. It's free. You can go to this website in your handouts. I'm a big fan of collegeparentsmatter.org, even if you don't have a kid that's in college, because of the way they broke it down. If you go to this website, click on topics, then click on cannabis, they have specific guidelines based on if you're not sure if your kid uses, but you don't know how much or often, or they use regularly. They make very clear, don't be afraid to start the conversation. It's worth disapproving of, and your disapproval is not naive. Pick a message to focus on and reject the myth that discouraging it doesn't make any sense because everyone's doing it. Know the data, make communication a regular activity, and recognize the power of your influence. Parents really are influential. And these are either the coolest parents ever, or there's a slight chance they broke their child. I'm married to my favorite person on planet Earth, a 6th grade teacher who only has 6 school days left, hooray, and gave out the assignment where people had to label the continents and the oceans. She showed this to me and I'm like, can I please take a picture of this? She said, don't show the name. This kid labeled Africa as Africa by Toto, who of course are the amazing band who sing Rosanna, and they sing about blessing the rains down in Africa. Either this kid's being funny, or if he genuinely thinks that's the name of that continent, those parents are super influential and we've got some work to do. So I will say one last thing. Even for adults, do be aware of recommendations for lower risk rather than low risk use. I grew up in Alan Marlat's harm reduction lab. We do harm reduction. Notice the title. It doesn't say low risk cannabis use guidelines. It says lower risk guidelines. This is a who's who of planet Earth's biggest experts on cannabis. They say if you look at the science, any use incurs risk. There is no universally safe level of cannabis use. Want to avoid harm? Don't use. If you make the choice to use low potency where possible. Realize there is no safe route of use, but that smoking is really risky. Keep use occasional. We were blown away that they added the cognitive thing. If you notice attention, concentration, memory affected, stop. If stopping is not realistic, says substantially reduce frequency and potency of use, and there's the driving guideline. They said, depending on where you were and what age group you work with, realize the women who are pregnant or breastfeeding are encouraged to abstain from cannabis use. And if people are actively dealing with or have a first-degree family history of a psychotic disorder, mood disorder, or substance use disorder, then abstinence or significantly changing their use is recommended. I think we need to get the science out there. I hope I've done my job and shown you there's a lot of recent research that tells a very consistent story. Keep doing what you're doing to collaborate. Communities that get people on the same page as far as a plan for prevention are the ones seeing successes. I was asked to take 55 minutes. I'm at 55 right now. I just want to say, why is it important to advance science? My favorite scientist of all time is Dr. Indiana Jones, who I believe is a real scientist. He was the focus of 3 very important movies. Some of you might go, I thought there was a 4th. We don't talk about the 4th. But why is it important to advance science? Dr. Jones said, fortune and glory, kid, fortune and glory, which is why I know you all do what you do. And of course, I'm joking. There's a quote that I think is pretty intense that says, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. I've seen that softened to be a little less hostile. This is without data, all we have are opinions. There are a lot of opinions about cannabis use. It's time for the data to just get out there because the data tell a very consistent story. Data matter, they tell the story. How do we translate findings? Tell the story. Make the findings digestible and clear without being too simplistic. Provide every citation and reference to boost legitimacy and credibility. Whether it's parent meetings, town hall meetings, peers, expert, you can get the science out there and know that college campuses have a number of people who would be delighted to partner with you. Sorry, that was 57 minutes, Taylor, but that was 57 minutes. I shouldn't take those questions in the middle. I should have saved the 15 you asked me to save. But with that, my email address is jkilmer@uw.edu. If there are articles I referenced that you would like, let me know if you can't find them. And with that, Taylor, you wanted me to put up this QR code. And I'll stop talking and tag over to you.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you so much, Jason. That was great. And so many resources that we will add in our follow-up email that are also included in the PowerPoint slides on our website.